countries like Singapore are getting way more than that anyway, so it's not an issue. All right, I'm going to keep moving here. I won't cover what I need to say. All right, so the other thing to say is that in terms of what you eat, animals are mainly, if you eat anything that comes from a meat or from an animal or fish, something that it's got legs and moves around or crawls on its belly, whatever, or swims, it's mainly protein and fat. Okay, just as a kind of a simple way to think about it. And if it comes from a plant, it's a carb. Unless there's three exceptions. Beans and kind of the whole legume family, they have a fair amount of protein, so they're one exception. And then nuts and seeds tend to have a lot of fat in them. But aside from those, as a rule, if it's from a plant, it's largely carbs. So, okay, that's the nutrition lesson. Next thing is brief history lesson. This is going to be really brief. Until about 10,000 years ago, sorry to write history. Just start all over again. Yeah, no, I'm not going to write it. So we were largely
handwriting.
Sorry, we were largely hunter.
It says Dr. Henry.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the best.
Yeah, is that? Oh, okay.
This is the best?
I can read it.
Oh yeah, this is. I went to medical school for 4 years to learn how to write so people couldn't read it.
So now you said it, right? So you can read it.
This is a prescription form.
Yeah, exactly. I have a great story about that. I don't have time for it. So until about 10,000 years ago, people, as near as we can tell, looking back at history, there was no farming before that time. There was no agriculture. So people were hunters and gatherers. And what did hunters and gatherers eat? Well, they ate animals because that's what you hunted. And then when you gathered, there was no orchard to go into and there was no field full of crops or rice to gather from. So you had to find kind of wild plants that were growing and dig them up or pick from them. And so when you gathered, you didn't get anywhere near the large amount of plant food that we get now, because it was just harder to find. You had to work hard to get it. And it was also quite raw. People weren't, at that point, they were just getting a little bit of it and they were pulling up the tuber out of the ground and they were chewing it, or they're finding a wild piece of fruit and eating it, but it was eaten kind of in a real raw fashion. So that was what people were until about 10,000 years ago. And then about 10,000 years ago in several places in this part of the world and in the Middle East, things started with agriculture. So that was about 10,000 years ago, agriculture started. And with agriculture, what happened was we got a lot more energy, because we started growing things, and there were all these plants that we grew, and plants have a lot of carbs, and carbs are a rich source of energy. And populations grew like crazy. If you kind of look at history, and that's why there's so many people in Asia, especially because you were really good at doing rice and cultivating lots of rice. And that provides a lot of calories, a little bit of protein, a little bit of fat. So that was really good for human populations. But people got smaller and weaker. If you look at historically what happened, if you look at, people look at the skeletons of people in the ground, of people who lived in this area 20,000 years ago, and they were taller and they were stronger. You can just measure the height, and you can measure the you can tell the size of the muscles by the way that the bone is structured. It has a bigger attachment if there's a bigger thing. So the hunter-gatherers who lived in this area before agriculture were there was much fewer of them, but they were in a way better fed as individuals. And that same thing happened all over the world. And if you look at still there are people who are only hunter-gatherers, and they tend to be taller and stronger than agriculture, because agriculture tended not to give you very much protein. It tended to give you a lot of carbs, and you had a lot of babies, a lot of them died, there's a lot of things happened. Okay, and then the other thing that happened, but overall, populations grew like crazy. And then about 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution happened. And the Industrial Revolution is the whole business about machines. And what happened with that to our food is a couple of things. One is but we got much better at milling and grinding our food. Before that, it was, with the rice, for instance, they would take the husk off the rice, and then after that, it was just a stone. You put the rice on a piece of stone and take another stone, and you just grind it that way. And so you got essentially the whole piece of rice, and it was coarsely ground. And then what we figured out since then is, okay, take the husk off, and then we'll polish the rice to get all that bran off the outside, which was some of the fiber and some of the fat, and some of the protein were there. But we polished that all off, so it's this pretty white thing, which we've gotten used to the taste of, and we think it's sweet and it's good. But we've actually taken away some of the other nutrients when we do it. We've also got good at grinding things that are very tiny and finding ways to extract the sugars out of it, and then putting sugars in packages, and then sending it to the people who make us tea and soda and cakes and other things. So we've found ways with the Industrial Revolution to move and this is the thing that's happened, is we've moved the carbs that we ate. So we went from lots of fat and protein and less carbs to many more carbs in our diet 10,000 years ago. To 200 years ago, we learned how to move our carbs from what is sometimes called complex carbs, and we've changed them to simple carbs.
Processed one?
By processing. And so another way to think about it is we move them from what we call slow carbs to fast carbs. And I'll explain that in just a minute. Okay, why do we make that distinction? But when I say complex, that's because even if rice or a piece of wheat, when it was just taking off the whole, it was kind of, there was a lot of things going on. There was the bran, some protein, some fat. It was complex. And then when we learned how to process it, we unfortunately made it into a simple thing. So, okay. Questions about that? Yeah. All right. So carbs. Just to be clear about carbs, let's list your 5 most favorite types of carbs here in Singapore. Rice. Noodles.
Wonton mee.
That's noodle.
Bread. Okay. Pastries. Yep, they're kind of with bread. Pastries. Yep.
Soft drinks.
That's considered bready too.
Okay.
Popiano.
One that actually, it's not on your list, but I'm going to put it here because people think maybe it's not, but it's big in other parts of the world. Potatoes. Potatoes.
Yes.
Okay. And then
cheese sandwich.
What's that?
That's bread.
And then the other big one is I'm gonna put here sugar.
Cupcakes.
Anything that's sweet.
Toast box.
Okay, which is almost everything you eat. People are adding sugar.
Soft drink.
Soft
Yeah,
drink.
that's sugar.
Soda.
Soda.
Soda is
Sorry,
sugar.
This is my ear.
Hot dog.
Sorry. Sodas have a lot of sugar. Soda's almost every tea you buy. I mean, they just poured every bit as much sugar in there, and almost every energy drink, almost every fruit drink. I mean, it's amazing if you
So
look
how
at the
about
ingredients.
zero Coke?
Yeah, so we'll come to that at the very end. Okay, so this is the point is all of these. If you look at the sugar molecule, I mean, I'll just draw it a little simple here. But I mean, there's a certain shape to a sugar molecule. These starches are all these things are these carbs. All they are is a whole bunch of sugar molecules that are just kind of packed together. And so when they're packed together like that, they don't hit our tongue feeling quite as sweet as regular sugar, but that's what they are. There's a whole bunch of sugars packed together. When you eat those things, and particularly if they're the finely ground, highly processed food like carbs like we've come to do, when these things hit the stomach, they become sugar within minutes. And so when you eat these things, these ones up above, okay, they will behave in your body and your stomach exactly like if you just took sugar or sweets or sodas. They are no different. So I'm gonna.
No, wanton mee.
So I'm gonna write here, no difference
No
from your body's
sugar.
perspective between eating sugars.
No more satay.
Post-box.
I think Roger's gonna kick us out.
Sorry, Roger. I knew you weren't gonna like this talk. Questions? Okay, so what we have in our body, I'm just gonna draw one graphic here. So we have a level of sugar in our bloodstream that our body kind of uses and maintains. And it runs, I'll put here this number of 100. And our blood sugar usually runs a little bit below 100, just kind of over time. And then what happens when we have a Coke or an orange juice or some bread or noodles for breakfast? Goes up. Yeah, goes up like this. And it goes up above this number where our body likes to see it. So it starts going up. And then what does our body do next? What's the response?
Active?
Insulin.
You crave more.
Crave more? Not yet. When you're going up, right now you still feel good.
Retain
Bring it down to the normal level.
Bring it down to the normal level. And what does it do to do that? What's it use? It's the insulin. Right. So then your body sees this happening, and you've got insulin. I'm trying to read. You got your insulin level. It's quite low. It's very powerful things down here. And then what happens is, your body goes, oh, that sugar's going up higher than I want it. And in fact, if sugar goes up too high, it will kill you. It's a toxic thing inside your blood. So what happens is your insulin will go up. It goes, oh, I need to address that. So the insulin level starts climbing, and then thankfully your body realizes it, and then it goes, oh, it has its effect. So then the blood sugar comes back down. Okay. So and then once the blood sugar comes down, then your body kind of turns off your insulin. Your insulin comes back down, and then you go forward to the next meal. Okay? So that your body has this system that's built to deal with your carbohydrates. So it seems like, well, it's so cool, and it's okay to eat carbohydrates. But there's actually 3 problems with this. So I'm going to point those out. So the first problem number 1 is, what does your body do with that sugar?
Burn it to fats.
Exactly. That's the first thing that your body does because when it sees that you got all this sugar in your bloodstream, it says, "Oh, look at all that! I can't have that. There's too much in there. What am I going to do with it?" Well, insulin signal says, "Send that sugar into fat." So if you eat sugar, it creates fat. So it's just kind of so that's problem number 1. At least for most of us nowadays, we struggle with our weight. So it goes the insulin sends it to fat. The second one, which probably will be obvious from this diagram, is that sometimes our body kind of overshoots because this thing has gone up and we've eaten a lot of carbs, and so sometimes we don't get it quite right, and instead of our sugar coming right down to where we want it, it starts to go a little lower than our body likes. And what happens at that point? Somebody said it earlier. Hunger. You get hungry at this point. So something that can happen the second time is it varies for people, but if you had something where you have a piece of bread or something, in the morning, 8 o'clock, and you go to work, and at 10 o'clock, oh, I'm hungry. I need something now. It's when that hunger kind of hits you. That's because this is what's happened. Your blood sugar has come up, it's come a little low. And so the second thing that can happen with this cycle is you can